One of the most common takes on filmmaking YouTube is that modern lenses are over-sharpened, overcorrected, and clinical. Vintage glass, on the other hand, has texture, personality, and character. But isn't that just a nice way of saying flaws? I've been practicing photography since I was 15 years old, and for that entire time, I've been chasing cleaner, sharper, better lenses. Which leads me to ask the question, have I been doing this photography thing wrong this entire time? To find out, I challenged myself to spend a whole week shooting photo and video with just one vintage lens, the Yashica 50mm f1.7mm. By the end of this video, we'll see if vintage glass lives up to the hype, or if filmmaking YouTube is suffering from a collective delusion. Before we get too far into my experience using this lens, if you value honest, technically literate reviews and breakdowns, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. I'm trying to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and something like 99% of my viewers aren't subscribed yet. This particular lens originally belonged to my late grandfather, which makes it a little more meaningful than a random eBay pickup. But sentiment aside, the Yashica ML series has an interesting history. These were Contax Yashica mount lenses from the late 70s and early 80s that shared designs and coatings with Contax Zeiss glass. The 50mm f1.7mm is known for its smooth, natural rendering, sometimes with a touch of swirly bokeh along the lines of the infamous Helios 44-2. It's not razor-sharp like modern glass, but that's kind of the point. I will address up front that this is not the most vintage-looking vintage lens that I possibly could have gone with for this challenge, but I did feel it was a good example of the kind of lens that people typically point to when they sing the praises of vintage lenses, somewhere in the middle between totally clinical and pure vintage character. Now, I will say that my copy of this lens isn't perfect. The focus ring was pretty sticky at the beginning of the week, and it probably needs to be re-lubricated, although it loosened considerably as I used it throughout the week. I threw on a newer focus gear when I first recovered this lens from my dad's storage bin last year, even though I don't own a follow focus. Partly because I might pick one up someday, but mostly because it gave me a bit more leverage on the barrel when the lens was still more difficult to manipulate. I adapted this lens to my Sony a6700 with a K&F Concept CY to E mount adapter. There's an affiliate link in the description if you're interested in picking one up. There are no Lightroom profiles for this lens, so unless otherwise stated, the image samples that you'll see throughout this video are exactly as the lens captured them. I had originally planned on sticking to JPEGs with a custom creative look for a more filmic aesthetic for the entirety of this challenge, but I did forget to compensate in camera for Sony's D-Range optimizer, so the JPEGs ended up looking pretty flat and overexposed. This led me to take a second look at the RAW files, and spoiler alert, the RAW images came out a lot better than the JPEGs, which we'll get to later in the video. I had a few major takeaways by the end of the first 24 hours of shooting with this lens. First of all, I discovered completely by accident that I can trigger focus magnification in photo mode on the a6700 by double tapping the screen. I've owned this camera for over a year and I had absolutely no idea I could do this, but I almost never use the touchscreen for anything except tap to focus, which might explain why I'm only now realizing this feature exists. Anyway, this feature was super helpful in making sure that I could nail focus. Second, without autofocus, you really have to slow down to nail focus, which is pretty tough when one of the main types of subjects that you shoot are living creatures with minds of their own. Third, this lens really benefits from stopping down. I will readily admit that I love shooting wide open, and I absolutely abuse the f1.2 aperture on my Viltrox Pro lenses, unless I'm doing product photography and have to stop down to get the entire product in focus. With the Yashica, f2.8 not only sharpens up the image and cuts down on the highlight bloom considerably, it also makes manual focus far more manageable, especially for video. However, this does kind of defeat the purpose of choosing a vintage lens in the first place. Even so, my hit rate wasn't great at this stage of the challenge. At the time, I estimated that I was nailing focus maybe 50% of the time. In fact, I originally tried to record this video vlog style over the course of the week, but when I tried recording my thoughts at the end of day one, I just slightly missed focus on myself. That's one of the major advantages of autofocus. It's just way more convenient and reliable than gambling with vintage glass and manual focus. After a full week of using nothing but this Yashica, my accuracy definitely improved compared to where I started. By the end of the challenge, I only missed focus on 52 out of 420 shots, which honestly isn't too shabby. With static or mostly static subjects, I could usually nail it. But my weak spot, and this became crystal clear by the end of day 6, was street photography. Street photography with a manual focus lens is really freaking hard. I missed a ton of shots, and even the ones that I did get were subpar in terms of composition. That's because so much of my attention went into just trying to land focus instead of worrying about framing, timing, or lighting. And when I stopped down to f4 or f5.6 to give myself a little bit more leeway, I felt like I was giving up one of the big creative advantages of a fast prime: subject isolation. I know a lot of people don't care about bokeh in street photography, but I do, and with this lens, I felt like I had to compromise that. Honestly, I found myself avoiding moving subjects entirely. I didn't even try to take certain shots because I knew that I'd probably miss. And waist level, zone focused, discrete shooting? Forget it. This whole experience gave me a whole new respect for the guys who were doing street photography before autofocus was even invented. They weren't just good, they were wizards. Moving on to raw optical performance, the biggest problem with this lens is flare control. Shooting into the sun is a disaster. It doesn't just add a little character, it washes out the entire image. And beyond that, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning of the video, I really didn't think this lens had that much of a unique look once you stop down. People always talk about vintage glass having character, but when I looked at the straight-out-of-camera JPEGs, this copy of the Yashica only showed personality in very narrow circumstances. Wide-open portraits in front of foliage where you get a hint of that swirly bokeh. Most of the time, though, it just looked worse than my modern lenses. Less sharp, less detailed, and definitely less reliable. The RAW files were a different story, though. After processing the images through DxO Pure Raw and dialing in the exposure in Lightroom, I did see how some of the images I'd taken had more personality and an almost painterly character compared to the results that I typically see out of my Sigma or Viltrox lenses. I think that this was most evident to me when looking at this series of images of my dog. The character of the out-of-focus background combined with the subtle bloom throughout the subject's fur did give a distinct and unique visual appeal to these photos that I don't normally achieve. But here's the thing, I would not trade that character for the convenience of autofocus, particularly when I'm trying to film myself for YouTube, which I found to be an absolutely infuriating experience. No autofocus means no safety net, and neither Monitor Plus nor the Sony Creators app offered a reliable way to punch in and check focus once I was seated across from the camera. I ended up so distracted by the process of making sure I was in focus that I forgot to start audio recording on one of my takes. Autofocus was invented for a reason, and if you're a solo creator like me, it's not optional, it's mandatory. So here's my bottom line. I think that the hype around vintage glass and even anamorphic glass is less about inherent beauty and more about standing out in a crowded YouTube or Instagram feed. And sure, there's some appeal to that, but if you don't have a dedicated focus puller or a crew, vintage glass is more of a headache than it's worth. And at least in the case of this lens, there isn't enough magic sauce to justify daily driving it. My advice, if you're a creator just starting your journey and you're tempted by the hype, I would think very carefully about whether you can afford to ditch autofocus. Because if you can't, you're probably going to regret it. What do you think, though? Am I completely off base here? Did I use the wrong lens for this challenge entirely? And do you have a vintage lens you think I should try? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching until the end of the video. I appreciate it more than you know. Next up will be a review of the brand new Moondrop Marigold, so if you come to this channel for my headphone reviews, know that you have not been forgotten. Until next time, this is Bedrock Reviews, signing off.